Hello, we are the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I am Dr. Kristen.
I'm Dr. Erin.
And you are very welcome to our YouTube channel. We are social scientists with PhDs who love talking about both popular and lived culture. We're educators who encourage empathy and inclusivity using conversations about everything from systemic racism to the tropes in Bridgerton. We love conversation, so make sure to subscribe to the channel and like and comment on this video if you want to join us.
This video is part of our Colonizers World Tour, which we will be spending the rest of this year looking at a different country each week and how their history and relationship with colonialism affects both their culture and how they interact with the world. So first up today, we are talking about Thailand. And we're going to start by saying what we thought we knew about Thailand before we did some research.
So we both knew that we really liked Pad Thai.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Pad Thai and Thai curry.
I knew that elephants were important.
Uh-huh.
And we have a lot of Irish friends that went to Thailand on their holidays because it's cheap to get there from Dublin.
Yeah, there's cheap flights from Dublin to Bangkok. I knew that. I have several friends who've done like weeks-long holidays in Thailand. So I know what I know from Thailand, I know from their pictures.
Largely, a couple episodes of Amazing Race.
Yeah.
And I knew that they were practiced largely Theravada Buddhism, just based on my history, but I didn't really know much past that. I was not expecting there to, from the pictures my friend shared, it was not a very like developed, I don't know, all their pictures are beaches and elephants. So like no one took pictures of like where people live in Bangkok. And so I never connected the dots that like, oh yeah, by the way, people live there.
Yeah, and like there's a huge amount of industry and they're very intentional about learning and speaking the English language because of their engagement with the world. Yeah, so a lot of a stereotype of what I perceived Thailand to be was much more rural and agrarian than it is in reality in 2021.
So there's about 66 million people in Thailand. For those of you who want to locate it on the map, it is in the Southeast Asian part of the world, and then narrow it down. It's surrounded by Cambodia and Laos, and it's in the same peninsula as Vietnam. It was never actually colonized. It is one of the 3 countries in the world that were not colonized by European influences, but Thailand was never colonized by anybody at all because of a whole host of really interesting geopolitical, international, I guess, machinations, like while things were happening.
Yeah.
There was let's look at some other demographics before I get into history, because I can talk about history forever.
The majority of people are descendants of speakers of Thai languages, but there's also different smaller ethnic groups, the Mon Khmer, Chinese, and Malays. And particularly interesting because of the relationship to Buddhism and how dominant Buddhism is. A lot of Malay speaking people have a distinct linguistic and religious identity because they are the population in Thailand that is Islamic as well. So that was, I found something really interesting. It was officially called Siam until 1939. And we'll get more into kind of the history of the development of its government. It's primarily agricultural. And now we're having factories from foreign countries and a lot of outside investment. We'll get into the sex trade and sex workers as well, but that is a huge part of Thailand and its tourism, which is a huge factor in how it engages with the world.
It's physically a tropical monsoon zone. It's a constitutional monarchy with an elected parliament. There's a whole lot of other things. Their currency is the baht. And as we record this in 2021, 1 baht is about 3 cents. So when you watch movies and videos and they talk about spending baht, like you can do that currency in your head. I did a little historical thing, and it's normally between 25 cents and 3 cents. Like it never kind of gets outside of that range in modern time, in recent times. The Theravada Buddhism, just really, really quickly, is the specific is a very specific stream of Buddhism that has to do with monks. So a lot of Buddhism is very individualistic. It's a lot about your own individual enlightenment. Theravada Buddhism says that you still need monks to kind of get us all to enlightenment, that humans have very distinct roles. You are either a monk that helps folks get there, or you are a patron of the monks. And those two groups of people both are important, and working together, it will then help people achieve nirvana, which is the largely rejection of all material goods. So Theravada is the Dalai Lama. It's the orange robes. It's a lot of that you see that people mix up with Hare Krishnas, which is a whole other thing. But it's largely practiced in few countries, and there are Theravada Buddhists all over the world for sure, but they are definitely most concentrated in Southeast Asia. The main industries, like Dr. Erin said, I'll transition to this. So they were largely agricultural until about the 1960s. And now at that point is when you get a lot of foreign intervention. So we want to talk about this really interesting thing that we have termed capitalistic colonialism.
Yes, because even though Thailand was never colonized in the way that we understand the term, especially from the history of kind of the transatlantic colonial movements coming out of Europe, there is still this idea that in order to succeed in the world, what we would say maybe globalization, there's definitely been an impact of the capitalism from places that were colonies. And so this idea that they are engaging with Britain and industry and bringing in all of these entities in a way that drastically changes the culture and impacts the way they interact with the world.
But specifically in the 1800s, like when the British came in and started their timber industry, and then there was tin mining, the money went back to Britain. The money did not stay in Thailand. Mm-hmm. And that is something that's happening at the same time as a lot of reforms. That monarchy is trying to open up things more to Western culture. So from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, there was this king who was a little bit of a 180 turn from who they had before. And he was the son of a king that had done a pretty good job, as you kind of look at what Thai people were saying about themselves, in encouraging industry, encouraging cultural growth, encouraging Thai identity, encouraging all of these things. Then you get his kid. His kid wasn't great. And his kid was like, you know what? Actually, no, I don't like it when people disagree with me. And I think I'm kind of cool. So he shut everything down. And if you disagreed with him, he shut newspapers down. It was a policy of absolutism that, from what the records show, the Thai folks were not super into.
No, they didn't care for it.
And so as this is happening, we get a fairly bloodless revolution, actually. Some really smart Thai students who were living in Europe at the time, and this idea of being Thai people also means you travel and you live other places is a really interesting pattern that we've noticed as we were studying some of the history. They pretty much figured out a way to overthrow the king using the military without any blood loss, which is incredible and something we should be talking about more. So we get that. As they're redefining who they are, the Thai people, World War II happens. After World War II happens, the Thailand gets shoved into some really complex international politics, specifically with the United States. And the way that capitalism interacts with Thailand continues to be interesting. And I think specifically once we hit the Vietnam War, we need to start talking about the sex trade.
And this idea of what it means to be Thai and the engagement with outside groups and other populations is so significant, especially in this 20th century development. And we found it really fascinating. And we wanted to make sure that we highlighted it because it helps you understand really Thailand of the last 50 and 60 years. And so you have a lot of conflicts during the 60s and 70s and 80s happening in adjacent Asian countries, grappling with colonial issues. More specifically, in the 1970s, you have Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge. In the 1960s and 70s, you have the Vietnam War. We have the Korean War. And we have all of this displacing a lot of people, bringing them into Thailand. And we also have Thailand looking at this and kind of creating an idea of a Thai nationality that is a huge part of how they see themselves now. They're really, really proud about being Thai people. And amalgamating all of these groups, from what we could understand on a basic level, it doesn't appear that there's a high level of discrimination against Chinese migrants, Vietnamese migrants, etc. And all of this also informs this idea that Thailand is a huge sex trade. Everybody knows the jokes. We have a really scary Google search that will show you exactly what people are Googling about women in Thailand. But we also have this growth of the sex trade in Thailand from this same internationalization and the access that people have to Thailand from the 1970s moving forward. And this boom really in an industry that people from all these other places can go to Thailand and access these services. We'll link to some articles that go into great detail about the extent of the sex trade in Thailand right now. It's a frightening amount of women. I think it was like 400,000, 300,000.
Yeah, and it's really important to know that prostitution is illegal in Thailand.
Yeah.
And yet it is still like super popular. And there are whole tourist companies that we've heard anecdotal tell of that arrange essentially like sex holidays for European men to go to Thailand and just have a lot of sex with a whole lot of women.
Yep.
And the fact that it is illegal means that sex workers have no protections at all. And there's lots of complicated and fascinating conversations about the decriminalization or legalization of sex work that we are not going to get into right now. But lots and lots of smart people on the internet would love to have that conversation with you. We'll link to a Sky News report as well that was filmed very recently about the impact that COVID has had on the sex trade, because again, it's not legalized. They can't file for unemployment. So all these kind of like really interesting things. We should say too that in terms of Thai women, Thailand is ranked 66th out of 162 countries in places that are not great to be a woman. So it's around the middle to better mark. About 29% of women over 25 have a secondary education. It's not super high, but that's still pretty good. And that there is some female representation in government in Thailand, but it is nowhere near statistically representative of the women in Thailand.
And I think we always, make a point of looking at gender when we dive into different cultures. And so obviously the sex trade was going to be a big part of that. But there's also different elements to this industry as well. And there's a huge urban and rural divide between the women who are sex workers. And a lot of the research we found shows that they're from smaller rural communities. They are often supporting their family. Thai culture has a very, very strong connection to family that is not even necessarily nuclear. Your extended family is your family. They don't have different words for cousins. In a lot of the dialects, you are just all brothers and sisters. So that's a huge part of it as well. Also, in terms of LGBTQ issues and access, it was decriminalized in 1956, but there is no same-sex marriage in Thailand. Both male and female same-sex activity are legal, but they do not have same-sex couples do not have the same rights and taxes and protections. So very similarly to what we had in the United States with but prior to passing same-sex marriage, where they had like to set a lower tier level of rights and access.
I had a harder time finding specific statistics on transgender rights within Thailand, but there were a couple really fascinating YouTube documentaries. Believe it or not, a Comedy Central comedian went to Thailand and had conversations with trans activists, which is interesting. So my feeling from researching it, and I could be totally wrong, and if this is your first time joining us, we love to be educated, is that this is potentially a newer conversation that is happening very publicly. And so, especially in terms of the sex trade, transgender rights is incredibly important in how we have conversations about sex workers. And it sounds like to me, from the research that I could do from not Thailand and not speaking Thai, that publicly this is a newer conversation for the Thai culture. What we've discovered as we've learned about this and why we're making these introductory videos, excuse me, is first of all that we really want to go to Thailand, but that the tourism industry is damaging to its environment and often to the people. So traveling responsibly is going to be a challenge even after COVID, and you take COVID away from the challenges. We've saw a lot about like how snorkeling is damaging the reefs and things like that. And so it's going to be a really interesting conversation to watch when tourism, which is a large part of the economy, builds itself back up, if sustainable tourism solutions are more of a conversation than they were in the past. Again, a documentary that we will link to that discusses the idea of the Thai tourism. We're really excited to learn about the incredible importance of familial relationships. We're excited to learn about food past pad Thai. We were really excited about that. And what we're going to do for the rest of the week is interact with art made in Thailand by Thai people for Thai people. And we are incredibly grateful to Netflix for bringing us some of those rom-coms that we can interact with and learn from in a way that, I mean, honestly, would not have been possible when I was growing up. So I'm really, really glad that we get to spend some time. And we're hoping as we have this whole week with you in Thailand on this piece of the Colonizers World Tour, that you learn as well. If you know more than we do, please hit us up in the comments and teach us what we need to know.
We hope that you enjoyed our Thailand 101, and which seeks to answer kind of two primary questions. What is Thai culture and how does Thailand interact with the world? So we hope we've given you, whetted your appetites on that, and we now release you into the world to go learn more about Thailand, as we will. And we will see you next for our video discussion of Bangkok traffic love story, which boy was it a fun ride, folks. We'll see you then.